He is America's first president, George Washington.
George Washington is a very important figure in American history. He was the United States of America's first elected president. He was also Commander-in-Chief in the Revolutionary War and a founding father of the United States of America. George Washington was born on February 22, 1732 in Virginia. He was the eldest of 6 siblings and also had 3 half-siblings. His family was a middle-class family. They grew tobacco, owned slaves, and built mills. As a young boy, George was homeschooled, and by the time George was in his early teens, he was a master at raising farm animals, growing tobacco, and surviving on his own. Sadly, when George was 11, his father died, so his older stepbrother Lawrence became George's mentor. As George grew older, he spent much of his time in the wilderness. When he was 16, George took a job where he surveyed the land. This taught him to become tough physically and mentally to the outdoor elements. George's brother Lawrence died from a lung disease when George was 20 years old. This meant that George was now the owner of all the Washington properties, including Mount Vernon and its surrounding land. Mount Vernon belonged to George's great-grandfather since 1674. It is a large plantation that at one time housed many farm animals, many slaves, and where lots of tobacco was grown. George expanded Mount Vernon into a large mansion when he became the owner. The house and the land is still exactly how George left it 216 years ago. At the age of 22, George became a major in the militia. George was a great leader and many people looked up to him. By the age of 23, he was promoted to colonel. In 1758, at the age of 26, George went back home to Virginia and got married to Martha Custis, a wealthy widow. They were unable to have any children. However, Martha did have 2 children from her previous marriage, both of which died in mid-adulthood but whom George loved and treated as his own. After the French and Indian War, the British were in desperate need for money, so they began to tax the colonists without their permission. This made the colonists mad and a war began between the 2 separate parties. In 1775, at the age of 43, George Washington was appointed General of the Continental Army. As a general, George had a very difficult task. He had to train poor farmers how to fight a very organized and powerful British army. George exceeded all expectations and held together his army through the toughest of times. Again, George proved himself as an excellent leader. After 6 years of battle, General George Washington led his army to victory, defeating the British at the Battle of Yorktown in October of 1781. George led the Constitutional Convention, which gave birth to the Constitution in 1787, replacing the Articles of Confederation. On April 30th, 1789, George Washington was elected as the first president of the United States of America. He was 57 years old. George is the only president to be unanimously elected, meaning that everybody voted for him. During his time in office, the first 10 amendments of the Bill of Rights were constructed. After his first 4 years of presidency, the people wanted George to run for office again. He was so well liked that no one even ran against him. After 2 terms in office, George decided that it was time for him to step down and let someone else be the president. He did not want this country to have a ruler like a king who ruled their whole lives. During his time as president, George Washington developed many rules and traditions that current presidents still practice. After leaving office, George returned to his beloved home, Mount Vernon, in 1797, where he enjoyed caring for his land and spending time with his wife, Martha. On December 14, 1799, George came down with a very serious sore throat after being outside in the freezing rain all day. Within a few days, he was unable to talk, swallow, or breathe. George died at home in his bed, and his last words were, "'Tis well." He was 67 years old. Per George's request, he and Martha are buried in a tomb at Mount Vernon. George Washington made a huge impact on this nation, and we remember him in many ways. We see his face on the quarter and on the dollar bill. His face is also carved into Mount Rushmore in South Dakota. There is a huge monument in Washington, D.C. that stands 555 feet tall, towering above all the other monuments. Washington State is also named after our first president. It is hard to go anywhere in the U.S. without running into a city, town, or driving down a road that is not named after President George Washington. George Washington is an American legend. He positively shaped our government and our nation.